education budget per children in Sub-Saharan Africa is currently 40 times smaller than the per children budget in the north. We live in a time period where the poorest country in the world have budget for basic education and health spending that are so ridiculously lower than the financial flow that they are paying to the north.
Hello, welcome to Equals, the podcast about inequality. I'm Grazielli.
And I'm Max. Grazie, great to be back on the podcast with you. And our last episode before Christmas and the holiday season. What do Brazilians do at Christmas time then? What's a Brazilian Christmas like?
I don't think this changed so much around, but maybe they do. Something that I think it's different for the two of us is that you might have a cold and white Christmas like we see in the movies. But for me, it's rainy and hot. So that's the different thing for us.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's rarely white here either, but it is dark and cold and rainy. That's true. New thing for me this year, Christmas. I've got my first Christmas jumper. Do you have Christmas? I suppose it's too warm in Brazil for jumpers.
Actually, I don't know what jumper is.
Okay, so a jumper is like a pullover, like a sweater, something.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
but
so,
we don't have that for Christmas here.
No, I should think not. But anyway, ours are like comedy ones with Santa on, and they're just horrible, horrible things. And I've always resisted getting one, but now my family have, press ganged me into getting a Christmas jumper. I'll send you a picture as long as you promise not to show anyone.
Oh, I was going to say let's post this picture for our listeners. Come on.
No, I think I'd rather die. But yeah, so the exciting thing about this episode, apart from my Christmas jumper, is we are interviewing Thomas Piketty, who's, I suppose, kind of the Santa Claus of the inequality world. I mean, incredibly famous. When people think inequality, there's hardly anyone more famous in the world, I don't think. So, and he's definitely one of my heroes. I loved his books. I think I'm probably, among the few people in the world who's read his books all the way to the end. But they are truly brilliant, and he's a brilliant man. So he's come to talk to us about the World Inequality Report they've just launched, hasn't he?
Wow, that's really a Christmas gift, right? To do this interview and to hear about the first findings of this new report. I really want to hear from him.
Yeah, it's really good. I've been wanting to interview him for years, so that's really fantastic. So shall we get into it?
Yes. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. You have been writing about inequality crisis for such a long time now. What is the new thing about inequality that you have found on this year's World Inequality Report, and why should our listeners care so much about it?
Well, let me say that this World Inequality Report 2026 is, the product of a very collective process. We have now more than 250 research fellows working with the World Inequality Lab from all around the world and contributing through their research to this observatory of world inequalities that we have been developing over the past 15 years. The main novel features of this new report, I would say, is probably, the focus on the north-south deepening inequality when it comes to financial inequalities, what often has been called the exorbitant privilege of the North in terms of financial income flow going from south to north due to the very unequal organization of the global financial system. And we bring new evidence on this, showing that, if anything, this privilege has extended from US to Europe and the rich world in general, and has grown in size over the past 20 years, just due to the differential rate of return on foreign assets, foreign liabilities, public debt has grown to over 1% of world GDP, which is, enormous amount of money, 3 times as much as all so-called development aid flows. And of course, this is running in the opposite direction and in the wrong direction. We have also a big part in the report on enormous gap in social spending between the global south and the global north. One number which I found particularly striking, which I did not realize, is that, the education budget per children in Sub-Saharan Africa is currently 40 times smaller than the per children budget in the north. I should say this is in purchasing power parity, so this is correcting for the differences in cost of living. If we are looking at the raw number computed at market exchange rate in dollars of euro using market exchange rate, it will be even bigger. It will be 3 to 4 times bigger. So this gap, this enormous gap in basic opportunities that the different children have in the world, this gap is actually even larger than the gap in income, which means that in fact, poor countries are doing better in education investment. Poor countries' government are actually transforming the little resources that they have to invest in public education. But at the end of the day, what this also shows is that, we live in a time period where, we say we are interested in inequality, we say we are interested in sustainable development, in the consequences of global warming, but in effect, we live in a time period where the poorest country in the world, which are also those who are going to suffer the most from global warming and the cumulative historical emission of the north, have budget for basic education and health spending that are so ridiculously low and so ridiculously lower than the financial flow that they are paying to the north through the unequal financial system. So I guess, some of this is known, but some of these numbers are actually much bigger than when I personally thought before starting working on this report.
Thomas, huge congratulations on another amazing report and so much in there of interest. On this particular issue of how the financial system and the unfair advantage of hard currencies to the euro, the pound, the dollar, the advantage that gives rich countries over countries of the global south, what do you think could be done about it? What could be done to fix this global financial inequality that sees money flowing from the poorest countries in the world to the richest?
Well, I think the international economic order has to change. And for this to change, it at the end of the day, this has to do a lot with the governance of the system. It's the same thing that happened at the national level with the shift from a censitary system where only the wealthy could vote in the 19th century to more democratic system in the 20th century with a more inclusive access to vote. And today international organizations are still very much governed under a censitary system where only the richest countries have a lot of voting rights. So I think to answer your question, increasing voting rights at IMF and World Bank for poor countries is the most important transformation, which could lead to very practical decision in terms of which countries get loans, in terms also of structural transformation of the international monetary system. I remember, a long time ago, at the end of World War II, Keynes was making this proposal about an international clearing union, an international currency. This did not happen, and in some ways, Keynes was trying to protect British interest more than the interest of the global south in many ways. But if we take this debate once again today and for the 21st century, the conclusion is that we have to think big in terms of transformation. We have to think big because the stakes are huge. The stakes are even bigger than those of post-World War II reconstruction. We have the stakes of global warming and new social division. And, we were talking about Africa before, when the population of Sub-Saharan Africa goes from 1 to 3 billion and you have global warming and what do you do exactly? What's your plan to address this? And now the good news is that there are solutions. So if you think, what happened with IMF special drawing rights, which is a little bit the beginning of a possible international currency, with a different voting rights system at IMF, we could issue more special drawing rights. After COVID, after 2008 crisis, there were actually new issues of special drawing rights, which is just like monetary creation, but with a currency that is a basket of all big currencies in the world and which is not tied to any of them. And you can increase money creation, which instead of going to each country its proportion to its GDP, should go to each country in its proportion to its exposure to climate change, to the size of its population, to the needs of the countries in terms of structural transformation, energy infrastructure, education and health needs. And if you do that, instead of having 2% of world GDP in special drawing rights, you have 5% or 10% or 15% of GDP, gradually you get to a different world. You get to a world where you can mobilize really meaningful resources, which can make a huge difference in terms of concrete education budget, in terms of abilities to build new energy infrastructure. And, I think this is not just a dream. I think this, at some point, this will have to happen, because if countries from the global north in Europe and North America in particular don't move in this direction, we all know what's likely to happen. What's likely to happen is that China and Russia to some extent, but in particular China, will propose to the global south a sort of parallel set of independent financial institutions in order to provide resources for investment. They will do so in a way that will not be particularly democratic or transparent. But, if this is the only option that countries in the global south have, more and more, this is the direction in which they will go. So the question today for individual countries, for instance, in Europe, is really to ask themselves, isn't it time to make new alliance with Brazil, with South Africa, with India, with smaller countries in the global south as well, to build a new vision for development based on equality, sustainability, and proposing coalition to change some of these voting rights, which, just to conclude, will change anyway, because they have already started to change. We should remember that the voting right and the GDP share of the United States right after World War II were close to almost 40% of the world GDP and voting rights at IMF. Today they have less than 20%, between 15 and 20. And I think that's partly what's creating a lot of tension in Washington, and why the current US president is so aggressive towards the rest of the world, is that at the end of the day, they know that their country is gradually losing their control of the rest of the world, and that, in the coming decades, their share in world GDP will go toward 10% and then less than 10%. So it's time to think about a different world order and different coalitions, which in some cases will have to work even, of course, without the US. And then, if some other administration in the US wants to participate, that's of course very good. But we cannot count on that, and we cannot wait for that to make progress.
Absolutely. Thomas, I remember a decade ago when I read your book, Capital on the 21st Century, it was so obvious that we have an inequality problem. But now, when we see these new numbers, these new analyses, these new reports, what we really see is that we have an inequality emergency, and we can't wait anymore. And what you have just said, that we need new coalitions working on reducing international inequality, seems so urgent. So I was willing to know, what do you think about what just happened before the G20 summit, when an extraordinary committee led by Joseph Stiglitz with others, came up with a proposal of a new international panel on inequality?
Oh, I think that's a great idea, which I fully support. I think the international panel on inequality is much needed, and the very fact that the initiative came with the South African presidency of the G20, I think is very interesting and is very telling. And in the same way, it was Brazil the year before which managed to put at the agenda of the G20 the idea of a global wealth tax, which is I think it's a very interesting evolution. When I wrote first in Capital in the 21st Century 10 years ago, or even a little more than 10 years ago now, that was in 2014. But when I was writing this, people, in particular most economists at the time, were sort of very skeptical, and the fact that 10 years later, in 2024, this was proposed at the G20 summit, and this was discussed by head of state, is to me very striking. And what's even more striking is that it came from the global south. It didn't come from social democratic European countries, which in a way have the more to lose from tax competition and should be in favor of this. They did not oppose the Brazilian proposal, and in the same way they did not oppose, most of them very openly, the South African proposal of an international panel on inequality, but they were not very mobilized in favor of it, in particular for the minimum wealth tax. And I think it's a sign that I think in the future, I believe a lot of the initiatives for change are likely to come from the global south more and more. Well, first because these countries are going to be more and more important in terms of population share, GDP share, and general political legitimacy to act, and also because these are the countries that have been losing the most from the international order organized by the northern countries. This demand coming from the south in favor of more economic justice, social justice, climate justice is going to be stronger and stronger. And what's very important is that this demand is able to materialize in concrete institutional proposal, concrete platform for institutional transformation about taxation, about education budget, and about new institutions like the International Panel on Inequality. Because I think it's through this concrete process of institutional change that gradually we will be able to build a new majority. I think the diagnosis that I was making 10 years ago about rising inequality in the world, in capital in the 21st century, is of course even more true today than it was 10 years ago. The problem is that over the past 10 years, most of the political initiative, in reaction to the failure of neoliberalism, most of the political action has come from, let's call it neo-nationalism, this kind of nationalist, extractivist, anti-migrant, anti-climate ideology that you see with Trump 2025 very clearly, but which could also see with Trump 2016, which we could also see with the Brexit vote, which we see in other parts of the world as well, but particularly in the US, in Britain, and in Western countries where you see this rise of nationalist anti-migrant ideology. And I think the social democratic bloc, or democratic socialist bloc, as I would prefer to call it, has been very weak in terms of making proposal and fighting back in order to impose their narrative and impose their platform. And this is what has been missing. And I think in the long run, I am confident that this camp and this side will be able to put forward their proposal, their platform, and to prevail. Because at the end of the day, the nationalist, extractivist agenda, or the mixture of nationalist, extractivist, and neoliberal agenda that we see on the other side is not going to address any of the social challenges and environmental challenges that we have to address. So at the end of the day, the world will need to turn to what was partly successful already in the past, in the 20th century, at least within the rich nation states of particularly in Nordic Europe and Western Europe, which is a combination of reduction in inequality, compression of inequality, investment in the social state, a gradual decommodification of the economy. And we have to pursue this movement, but at a much more global level, putting at the center of the analysis north-south inequalities much more strongly than what was done in the 20th century, and also with a much more emphasis on structural transformation, decommodification, and also dematerialization of the economy in the long run. So what's important is to build some collective coalition, some collective platform, collective movement going in this direction, and this is what has been missing so far.
Thomas, your optimism is infectious, and I really hope that we are in the long run heading towards a more equal world. But don't you worry that in fact things are going in the wrong direction, and that in many ways barbarism is certainly more likely in the near future than socialism?
This is not necessarily an optimism for next week or for next year. I'm trying to look at long run trends, and I'm just saying we should not lose hope because, in the long run, what we've seen in the past is a movement toward both more equality and more prosperity. Typically, if you take the income scale in Europe 100 years ago as compared to today, it has been compressed by a factor of 10. And, not only in Sweden or Norway, which were incredibly unequal countries 100 years ago as compared to today, but even in Germany, France, or even Britain, if you compare the income scale today with 100 years ago, it has been compressed by 10. In spite of the return of inequality in recent decades, we are not at all in the situation of 1914. So there's been, in the long run, a big compression of inequality, and, it has been incredibly successful on all grounds. If you had told the elite of 1914, okay, this is what's going to happen, we're going to compress the income scale by 10, the size of government is going to go from 10% of GDP to 40, 50% of GDP, the people at the time would have told you, look, this is communism, this is going to be the collapse of the world, the collapse of the economy, the sky is going to fall. But in fact, it was an incredible success, and this is the basic reason for me for optimism is just to say, look, the past century has been a century of incredible progress in the direction of equality. Now, it did not happen just like this. The important thing is that it happened only through enormous social struggles, collective mobilization, collective organization, trade union, socialist party, social democratic party. They were really pushing for a very ambitious agenda of economic and social transformation. And so this is this energy that we have to rebuild today, but at a more global level, because at the time it was largely confined to the rich nation states of the north, with sometimes very little consideration for the south. And so today we have to be much more global in our perspective. But I think, the basic reason for optimism is still that we can build on this successful experience from the past and try to pursue this direction. But, the other reason why this is taking so much time and why this is so complicated, let's be clear, is that, the collapse of the Soviet Union on the one put a very strong setback to every discourse that was trying to think of another economic system. And the other reason why it's so complicated today is that in the period of the 80s, 90s of sort of neoliberal euphoria, and with these views that we were going to solve every problem of the world by market competition and deregulation. So you have this sort of post-communist and globalization of the 80s, 90s challenges which have to be addressed together. And at the end of the day, I think we will manage to address them. But there are good reasons why this is taking time, and this is still going to take time. But that's one additional reason to work together to try to build this momentum in the years to come.
Thank you, Thomas. I mean, to be honest, you're very convincing, and I agree with everything. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it, and keep up the amazing work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Grazie, what did you think of Thomas Piketty then?
Well, it was really interesting. And something that caught my attention is that lately we were hearing all the time that the global inequality was reducing, that the majority of inequality was inside of countries. And now what he's saying is that this report is actually saying that there is a big problem between the global north and the global south related to economic inequality, and that this is really relevant to measure inequality globally. So this really called my attention.
Yes, me too. I mean, he wasn't saying that within country inequality is not a problem. He's basically saying, in addition, you've got this really interesting thing about, the euro, the pound, the yen, the dollar, giving those countries a really unfair advantage so that they can borrow more cheaply and they can lend that money to the global south. And basically, a kind of structural inequality in the financial system. So money's being sucked from south to north. I thought that was, I agree, really, really interesting and new.
Yeah, and that we can't ignore. And I even liked what he said, that if big financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, if they don't change the way that they operate, if there is no governance reform of these financial global institutions, what might happen, considering the scenario we have with the BRICS, with the new development bank, what might happen is the global south countries where the majority of the population live might move from these spaces like the IMF and the World Bank to the NDB. So this is something really relevant for them to take seriously. They need to make a financial governance reform. Otherwise, we might have a new scenario globally, right?
I agree. And I think the other striking thing for me was his optimism. I mean, it was cautious optimism. It wasn't naive in any way, but I think he really felt that the long run trend is towards more equal societies. And I mean, I'm not sure I'm convinced, to be honest. I also, there's another reading of the 20th century that would point to the fact that it took 2 world wars and immense human suffering before we got the kind of progress in the second half of that century. So I do worry that things may have to get a lot worse before they get better. But I hope he's right, and I think it's important to be optimistic, don't you think?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, that we need to be realistic, but we also need to be optimistic. We need to look at situations and truly believe that we can change them. Otherwise, how are they going to be changed, right?
That's the famous Gramsci quote, isn't it? It's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. You need to be realistic about the world out there, but you have to believe that things can get better.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so that was the first. We should have said this at the beginning of the episode. This was the first of 3 episodes looking at economic inequality from different directions. This one with Thomas Piketty before Christmas, and then 2 just after Christmas when we launch our annual inequality report to coincide with the Davos meeting next year with the latest statistics on billionaire wealth, and a focus this year on the capture of politics by the super rich. It's a great paper, and I think it's going to be really interesting. So we've got 2 more episodes on economic inequality coming in January, so make sure you tune in for those because they're really good.
Yes, make sure to do that. And you can find us on X at equalshope. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at equals.inc.
Yes, www.equals.ink, and then you'll have the latest facts and information, and it's just really cool. So do that and have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you all in 2026.
Yeah, see you in 2026.
Cheers, everyone.